Tonight, we're going to go ahead and talk about fat. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concern? Ooh, yeah, we can talk about that outside of class. The getting through, because it's hard. But does anyone have any questions from the exam or otherwise that you guys would like to go ahead and talk about right now? Okay. So a thing that everyone should keep in mind is fat is often maligned as something that's absolutely horrible for our health. And then the other side of it, which is fat is the only thing you should need and everyone should go keto. It's definitely very important when it comes to just general overall health and a little bit in performance. And when it comes to those, we'll talk about why in a bit. Now, it's a great fuel source for low intensity exercise. In fact, ultra marathoners might be the folks that actually want to go ketogenic just because there's no chance you're going to be able to support your entire duration on nothing but effectively fat or glycogen stores inside of your body. Now, like anything else, we want to make sure we're getting in enough fat, specifically the essential fatty acids, which your body can't synthesize, in order so we can maintain different things like essentially membrane health and integrity, as well as using cholesterol to make things like hormones. And it turns out every cell in our body has a phospholipid bilayer, meaning we literally have every cell's wrapped in fat. So you're kind of needed. Now, we store a whole lot of fat, and obviously some folks store more than others. And this is going to be something we can't free up as quickly as we'd like, much less metabolize it as quickly as we like. And that's why we're going to see that really fats are never going to burn faster than carbohydrates, irregardless of what anyone posts on social media. It just doesn't work like that. But obviously they're an important fuel source. So when it comes to our metabolism of fat in our body, when we happen to be exercising, we're going to be utilizing intramuscular triglyceride stores. So that's the fat that we just happen to have currently in that muscle fiber we're using. We're also going to free up fatty acids from our adipocytes, so our individual fat cells. And so the triglycerides are going to be broken down into 3 fatty acids, hence the 3 arrows, and glycerol, and that's going to be used to hormone sensitive, done thanks to hormone sensitive lipase. We're going to talk about how that's controlled. They'll then go into our bloodstream, where typically they're going to be bound up to a protein called albumin, and then eventually be received and pulled into our muscle cells. Now, we also have very low density lipoproteins. This is going to be one way that they're essentially packaged up and sent around the body after digestion. And thanks to lipoprotein lipase, that in turn is going to be able to pull that from the endothelium, put it into the muscle cell. Glycerol is going to go into the bloodstream. It can be used aerobically for energy inside of the muscle, as well as it can go into the liver and undergo gluconeogenesis and generate new glucose, which we'll obviously use as a fuel source. And remember, we only break down fatty acids inside of our mitochondria thanks to the process of beta oxidation, and we need oxygen in order for it to run. So hence it's useless to us as an anaerobic energy system. Now, what we have over here is general availability of different substrates in the body. So we can see the total amount of calories we're going to have, that's going to be inside the brackets of effectively breaking down our plasma glucose for energy, liver glycogen, muscle glycogen. So altogether, we're talking about 2,000 calories, and actually a little bit more than that since we're not talking about the blood. But it turns out at the end of that, you're going to be brain dead because you don't have any carbohydrates in your bloodstream, not very useful, if we somehow perfectly used everything, as well as obviously completely depleted from those energy systems. Whereas we look at the amount of fat we're going to have available, on average, most folks are going to have hundreds of thousands of calories of fat stored in their body, which is going to be quite the energetic availability that we can utilize for performance. Now, fat oxidation can only go at the rate that enzymatically it's going to allow itself to go. So one of the first limiting factors on how quickly this is going to occur is going to be via breaking them down inside of the fat cells, lipolysis in the adipocytes. And this is going to be controlled thanks to hormone or hormonal intervention. The key is epinephrine, cortisol to a lesser extent, is going to activate what's known as hormone sensitive lipase. That's going to break this down, put it in the bloodstream, and that's where you'll see it bound up to albumin so it can be shipped around. Insulin, on the other hand, is going to inhibit this action. So when we're taking in a lot of carbohydrates and even also protein is going to increase insulin level, we're not going to be breaking down fats as much as a fuel. And based on this mechanism, this is why you see a lot of folks talk about low carb diets as a means to help you use more fatty acids. But the key is energetic balance. If we're requiring the demands inside of the body that we need to have this fuel available, we're going to naturally have more activation of hormone-sensitive lipase. We're going to use those calories. We're going to break things down. Now, from there, these fatty acids are going to be removed from the cell, and they're going to be going through that phospholipid bilayer and be transported around the bloodstream. Some of them will be converted, and that's going to be the liver through into plasma lipoproteins, which is a combination of both fatty acids, cholesterol, and proteins into, now you can think about high density lipoprotein, low density lipoproteins. It's just the way it's packaged and how it's going to be moving throughout the body. So once we get into the bloodstream, most of this is going to be bound up to albumin, and it has what's known as a high affinity binding site. So these are sites that fatty acids easily bind to, because remember, fats are naturally hydrophobic. So it allows them to essentially be stuck to it, for lack of a better term. And there's 3 of those. This is going to be where we're really carrying the fatty acids around inside of the bloodstream. Now, this literally means the vast majority are bound up. Very small amounts are going to be floating around, because once again, the hydrophobic aspects of fatty acids. So when we get done eating, we're going to see an increase in our fatty acid, our lipid levels. Now, what we can see is this number comes up, especially when we talk about doing really, really long exercise of up to 2 millimolar. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard about people getting their lipid levels checked, and this is part of that component, which is we're going to obviously see how much is available. When you're exercising, this is a good thing, because this is obviously a fuel source. If you're just hanging out and you've got greater amounts, this is going to be a problem. And the key is we only can support a certain maximal level of fatty acids floating around inside of the bloodstream. Now, once we get to those muscle cells, we're going to use a number of different proteins in order to effectively pull those fats into the muscle. Some will go straight through, specifically our medium and short chain fatty acids, but from there, enzymatically, it will be acted upon in order so that these fatty acids are going to be bound up to carnitine. And through the carnitine acyl CAT1, CAT2 transporters, we're going to allow that acylcarnitine, so that's a fatty acid bound up to a carnitine, go into the cell. No worries, and I will do that, Colleen. And once it's inside, that effectively carnitine will release. It'll now be bound up to an acyl-CoA, or to a CoA molecule, and that's where we'll have beta oxidation cleaving off 2 of those carbons at a time. So what we have here, guys, is a picture of a mitochondria and that lipid. So it's that fatty acid intramuscular triglyceride store, and you see how it's literally adjacent to it for a great quick breakdown. And then we see these little black pebbles or little black dots, and that's actually going to be glycogen granules. All right. What question do you have on this slide, Colleen? Whenever you're ready. Oh, okay, no worries. Are you good to go, or do you need another moment? Okay. And I've updated these slides, guys. I'll put them up on Blackboard. I just have made some modifications to cover a little bit more. So this is a obviously zoomed in version where we can see how, thanks to acyl-CoA synthetase, we're going to have the fatty acids and now have acyl-CoA bound to it. From there, through CPT, or CAT1 is really how I learned it. It's just carnitine protein transferase, I believe, 1 and 2. Now that fatty acid is bound up to carnitine, it's going to go through translocase into the mitochondria. From there, we're seeing that exchange again. Carnitine is going to go back and cycle on through. And each time we go through beta oxidation, we're going to just cut off, remember, just 2 carbons. And when we do that, we're going to be getting that 1 NADH and FADH2, as well as then that acetyl-CoA is going to in turn go through the citric acid cycle itself. So, and then all those products, the NADH and FADH2, feeds into the electron transport chain. So, as it binds the fatty acid, the CoA is going to be released. We're going to go ahead and transport it into essentially the matrix side of the mitochondria itself. From there, carnitine palmitoyl transferase. And carnitine is going to cycle on back. And what's really fascinating is short chain and medium chain fatty acids are seemingly able to just diffuse into the cell. So it's still going to use the fat / CD36 transfers in order to get other ones into the mitochondria. Now, when we're exercising, the amount of fuel we're going to use is heavily influenced by the intensity of the exercise we're doing. As we've talked about before, guys, as exercise intensity goes up, our reliance on muscle glycogen and blood glucose is going to go up rapidly. Whereas the total amount of fatty acids we're going to use is going to peak at usually a moderate intensity and then go down because we're preferentially needing to utilize carbohydrates to keep up that performance. And so this is fatty acid availability. So control lipid heparin. Heparin is just going to make more fatty acids available. Notice the actual oxidation rate doesn't really increase that much. So as we go up in exercise intensity, we go down in the amount of fat that we're going to be metabolizing. Think back to our conversations about respiratory exchange ratio that we've had in exercise science, as well as, touch upon obviously briefly in this course. So, we got a slide in progress. Fun, fun, fun. Now, one thing that we want to make sure that we're contextually working with, actually, none of these matter. Don't worry about that one. This is going to be for one of our later things. I was making some updates. I forgot to do that. One thing that we want to keep in mind effectively is as we're increasing that intensity, you can see how we're using more and more glycogen, and we're slowly going to be increasing the fatty acids to about that midpoint peak that we saw earlier, as well as we're going to be utilizing a bit more plasma or less plasma fatty acids, irregardless of the intensity we're going at. Now, one thing to keep in mind is contextually how much fat do we need? Now, we're really talking about making sure we're getting enough essential fatty acids. When we think about essential fatty acids, we're talking about alpha linolenic acid and linoleic acid. So our omega-3 and omega-6 that are necessary. That's going to come down to typically it's going to be listed about 0.6 grams per kilogram of body mass. One of my friends, Eric Trexler, who hopefully will get to speak to the class at some point, the variation he likes to use on this is take the height of the individual minus 150 centimeters. So it's in centimeters minus 150, multiply that remainder by 0.5, and then add 30 to that sum as kind of a base idea of effectively how much fat we want to have someone take in per day. So the reason we want to have that, just like with carbohydrates, is we've got a good working idea of how much we really want to have an athlete take in. Can we go lower than that? Can we go lower than the minimum? Absolutely. That is a great way to describe it, guys. You can, but it's not going to be a good time. We're going to have issues with recovery. We're going to have issues with normal, healthy hormonal production. You're not going to be doing too well. This is things that people do as kind of a last ditch little effort at the end of a really obviously exhausting diet for things like a bodybuilding show, something that's obviously very aesthetically oriented. Now, like anything, we don't want to go under this for much longer than we need to. And we can obviously go far, far over this based upon what someone's goals are with training and performance, as well as what type of macronutrient they personally prefer. Now, when it comes to just putting food in the diet or fat in the diet, foods that happen to be high in fat, what are some ways that we'll typically describe them when it comes to enjoying them as a food? Yeah, it's usually more satiating, things that have fat to them. It's the three things that our mouth is essentially rigged for, which is sweet, and then essentially some type of fat, and then as well as that, the salt content. So, you guys ever watch the TV show The Good Place? They've got a line about frozen yogurt in there, effectively, where it's like ice cream, only worse. Because with frozen yogurt, what have we effectively removed? Bingo. Bingo. So when we happen to be obviously exercising, we're going to see that we're going to utilize beta oxidation up until we really get over about 85% of our VO2 max. Then we're really just relying on both aerobic and anaerobic carbohydrate breakdown. Okay. Now, as far as this being a limiting factor for aerobic capacity, not really. It's going to typically be obviously the glycogen and our carbohydrate stores. That's our limit on how fast we can go. We're going to see as individuals get to be a bit more well trained, they're going to really use relatively similar amounts of fat. And now notice, guys, this is a fatiguing trial where we're literally having someone exercise for 4 hours straight, a little bit beyond what a lot of you guys are probably going to do. And when it comes to our diet, depending on the last meal you've had, whether it was a high fat meal or a low fat meal, and essentially in ratio to the carbohydrates we're taking in, that's going to also denote which fuel we're going to use preferentially. So if you just did a high fat meal, not a lot of carbs, you're going to naturally be utilizing more fats as fuel. If you just used or had a high carb meal with a low amount of fat, you're going to see the opposite. And what we're going to also find is, in general, obviously greater carbohydrate intake. Remember, we're breaking or we're shutting down that hormone sensitive lipase, so we're not freeing us up as much fatty acids from the cell. And in turn, we are going to obviously not be utilizing as much fat as a fuel. So what we have up here, guys, is that different types of essentially transferrin that is going to allow fatty acids into the mitochondria with those medium chain fatty acids. And so octanoic acid, go figure, it's got 8 carbons to it, and our short chain fatty acids, so those are going to be like our 2 and 4. Those in turn are in theory able to go straight into the mitochondria. That's part of the arguments. You can use MCT oil as a means to enhance your mitochondrial delivery. It just doesn't work like that. Now, the good news is thanks to training, we're going to increase the amount of mitochondria we have inside of a given muscle fiber or muscle cell that we're using. This is going to also increase the number of enzymes inside of it. So because of this, we're going to be able to utilize more aerobic fuels and obviously fatty acids that are lower intensity. So we're going to touch on the Randall cycle in a little bit. Now, when we increase the amount of capillary density, we've got better blood flow, which means we're going to be able to deliver more fatty acids to that given individual muscle fiber. Now, what we're going to see is increases in the proteins that in turn are going to help with the uptake of fatty acids into the muscle cell itself from the capillary, from the blood flow, as well as we're going to have increase in our carnitine palmitoyl transferase, which is going to allow us to get those fatty acids into the mitochondria and utilize them for energy. And like anything else, an increase in intramuscular triglycerides is a normal adaptation to training. So literally individuals do a lot of aerobic work and otherwise, they actually, if we looked at biopsy of their muscle, they're going to store more fatty acids inside of their muscle than someone that's lightly trained or relatively sedentary, though paradoxically, well, not paradoxically, individuals that are very, very sedentary and specifically typically tend to be overeating, they'll actually have larger intramuscular triglyceride stores inside of their muscle as well. So the very, very fit, and then the other end of that continuum. So obviously we touched on where our dietary intake is going to influence. Obviously, we're going high carb, low fat, less breaking down fat, and the opposite is true. So when we're taking those carbs, because of the effects of insulin on the hormone sensitive lipase, we are going to not be utilizing as much. And what we're going to find is whenever we happen to be taking those carbs, it's also going to be slowing down effectively our natural transport that happens to be going to the cell. Does this mean we shouldn't eat carbs? Heck no. Instead, this more or less is something to keep in mind contextually with what our goal is to allow our athletes to perform on a high level, but also if our goal is to try and change their body composition, to understand that we should probably also look a little bit at manipulating our carbohydrate intake, but more importantly, our total calorie intake to make sure that we're going to be working towards getting that individual in a deficit. So how we're going to regulate whether or not we're using carbs or fat as a fuel, that's going to be the Randall cycle. So what we have here, guys, is effectively an image looking at effectively how we're going to have both positive and negative feedback when we happen to be going through and just utilizing our natural metabolic pathways for energy production. So notice we're dropping a lot of epinephrine and calcium in the muscle, calcium meaning we're doing contractions. We're going to be breaking down those triglycerides from the intramuscular triglyceride store into the fatty acids and getting them in the cell. However, if we have large amounts of malonyl-CoA, because acetyl-CoA is converted accordingly, it's just 3-carbon molecule, but that literally means we're not metabolizing as much from beta oxidation. Also, high amounts of hydrogen, meaning we're utilizing a lot of anaerobic glycolysis. So we shouldn't be trying to break down fats as fuel because it's going to go slow, as well as less carnitine available. So that's going to slow down this process and not allow us to use fats as fuel. On the flip side, we're going to be breaking down carbohydrates at a faster rate when we've got high levels of calcium, greater amounts of ADP and AMP, along with free-floating phosphate. And the same is going to be true when it comes to converting pyruvate into acetyl-CoA when we happen to be going at a higher intensity, because not much of this is going to be available because we're not going to be having it sit around long because it's going to be metabolized as rapidly as it can. So what we're going to find is we can have a little bit of positive effects of sparing our glycogen if we've got greater fatty acid levels before. And let me actually go back here, guys, and you can actually see it, where if we're giving folks lipids essentially before exercise, we can see after exercise, that group that had the greater amount of free-floating fatty acids from the carbohydrate they took in, they are actually preserving more of their muscle glycogen. Now, keep in mind, it's just because they had more fuel available. It's not because fat has some type of amazing ability to help save carbohydrates. It's important instead to keep in mind, this is more of an example that the fact of when we have these fats available, we in turn are going to be able to use things that are more freely available inside of the bloodstream. So we can potentially have a positive effect for sparage of glycogen when we happen to be taking this in, when we're trying to exercise. The problem with this is the fact that a lot of folks don't really tolerate taking in a fatty meal while they happen to be exercising. If they do, go for it. Have fun, get after it. But also keep in mind when we talk about different causes of GI stress, so the physiological component of making sure that we're not overwhelming what they can break down essentially through metabolism in their GI when they might not have as much blood flow going to the area due to the exercise intensity. So this is where some folks, they have the idea of utilizing ketone supplements or utilizing MCT oil as a means to help enhance performance here. The science hasn't really shown it to be that advantageous yet. You're really better off just drinking a carbohydrate beverage. You don't have to get that exotic with it, but understanding there's potential reasons why we're going to do these things. So when we happen to go on really high fat diets, and you're seeing that happen more and more because what type of diets are becoming very popular these days, guys? Yes, the keto diet. And what is like the even more bro version of the keto diet? Killing it, Colleen. Great job. The carnivore diet. So we live only on the flesh of the animals in which we have murdered. So what we typically see is when you have individuals do very long-term fatty acid or high fat diets, potentially they get more of those mitochondrial changes and more of those overall positive aerobic benefits. So there might be a use to play around with certain aerobic athletes to spend a phase of the year in a much higher fat intake with a obviously pretty low carbohydrate intake. If the person's diabetic, if they have issues with hypoglycemia, don't do that. That sounds incredibly dumb and dangerous. So what we're going to really see is whenever you give folks just a higher carb or a higher fat diet, when compared to the controls, they both do better. However, when you just do a high carb diet, and notice this is the effects of training for 7 weeks, the high carb is actually the one that's going to have the more advantageous changes. So yes, we can get a bit more fat metabolism, but it doesn't really change our performance. Now, I will say that potentially if you're going to go do a ultra marathon, so we're talking being out there for over 100 miles or more, yeah, you might want to play around with a high fat diet because it turns out, yes, the human body has a lot more fat reserves than will ever have the ability to store carbohydrate. You can obviously do intra workout carbohydrates, but you might still be looking at limits there. It might be something worth playing around with. However, I would by no means think that this is the end all be all way to approach it. So when it comes to supplementation of fatty acids in the diet, okay, there's obviously, you see a lot of ads for things like fish oil. I'm sure some of you guys have seen things like conjugated linoleic acid, how they can potentially have positive effects on health. Still need more research on the area. And then now we're starting to see the supplementation with ketones as a means to potentially enhance performance, cognition, and otherwise. And really, the research shows that long-term omega-3 fatty acid intake, so this is going to be, you see how literally from the omega at the end of fatty acid, we see our first double bond at the third carbon. That's why it's the omega-3. Omega-6, we're going to see the first one at the sixth carbon. So we have alpha linolenic acid, which eventually is going to convert into docosahexaenoic acid, EPA, and then eventually that is going to convert into docosahexaenoic acid, which is DHA. Now, each of these, EPA is very important for just kind of overall inflammation in the body. DHA is very much so heavily incorporated into your nervous system, specifically myelination. So it's important. Caprylic acid, we did touch on briefly earlier, in that it's going to have a overall, typically a slight antibacterial, antiviral effect that it's in coconut oil. That's one of the MCT oils that we're going to see. But we're going to give you guys your first group exercise. We're going to divide you guys into effectively 4 groups, okay? And what I want you guys to do is you need to find a specific individual fatty acid within the group you're in. So group 1 is going to have saturated fatty acids. Group 2 is going to have trans fatty acids. Group 3 is going to have polyunsaturated fatty acid. And group 4 is going to have monounsaturated fatty acids. I want you to give us 2 healthy examples of those fatty acids, and then give us 1 unhealthy examples of a fatty acid from that group. And then you can describe foods you might find it in. But don't say butter is bad for you because of this. No, 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 no. Tell me the individual fatty acid in butter that you're using as an example of an unhealthy monounsaturated fat or polyunsaturated fat or saturated fat, because we're going to find it exists in all of them. Does anybody have any questions before we send you guys over to start to figure this out? And be ready, obviously, to paste it back into the chat for what you guys came up with. All right, seeing as how I'm talking to myself, I'm going to open those rooms. You guys go ahead and go for it. Have fun. And I will see you guys back at about 6:37, 6:38. Give you guys obviously a solid amount of time to work together. 2 examples of a healthy option, 1 example of an unhealthy option. Individual fatty acids. And then can you name an unhealthy fatty acid as well? Guys, you have to name individual fatty acids. Walnuts are not a type of fatty acid. Potentially, yeah. Too much alpha linoleic acid can be an issue. Gamma linoleic acid or linoleic acid actually is a healthier issue or healthier choice, which you're going to find more from evening primrose oil, as well as when we're looking for another option is going to be, EPA and DHA, which are 2 other polyunsaturated fatty acids that are healthy for the diet. Okay, good. Linoleic acid is a poly, it's not a mono. Good. Nice work, Colleen. It's tricky, guys. It's tricky. That's why it was not meant to be an easy thing that you guys had to think through what happens to be. But to be fair, monounsaturated fatty acids is actually the one fatty acid group that you can't really easily find an unhealthy variation. It's actually pretty difficult to do so. Trans fats are technically polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're not saturated fats. So there are going to be healthy variations of those. And then where's my group with the saturated fatty acids? Oh, where's the monounsaturated fatty acid group? That's okay. That's okay. You guys are learning, and there's a lot to know. There's a lot to know. So Bree, Cass, Colin, oh yeah, that is the saturated group. Interesting. So mono group, Abby, Celia, Maddie, Mandy, or Samantha, what did you guys come up with? Okay. Now, Colleen, that's caprylic acid, lauric acid. Those are going to be 2 saturated fatty acids that are going to be really are healthier options. And yeah, you can go stearic acid, and palmitate would be an issue. Mandy, you guys are right. Monos, like I said, that's a really, really difficult one to find, one that doesn't go against. Now, herein lies the problem when we talk about fatty acid intake. How many of you guys just immediately thought, oh, I need to talk about a food? No, 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 no. There's a lot more granular information in there. And you guys have not really had to know other than before, trans is bad, saturate is bad, poly, good, mono, good. Like, nope, nope. There's more nuance there. And it's important that we understand there's a big damn difference between you're getting all your saturated fats from doing nothing but like butter and dairy sources, and you're getting all your saturated fats because you're just putting out a lot of coconut oil. Now, the coconut oil is probably going to work as a laxative when you're doing that much, but it's not going to work against you. Just like there's a big damn difference between getting in all your polys because you're doing corn oil and you're getting in all of your polys from eating actual wild salmon. Both are giving you polys, very different effects on your overall health. So that's why we get granular there, guys. I know it probably seemed like a bit much, but does that make sense now that I've kind of talked it through with you guys? Groovy. So When it comes to our overall performance, remember guys, again, fatty acids really aren't giving us any major effects to enhance our performance, okay? Fasting, so if we're not eating anything for a while, our body's naturally going to not have as high of glycogen stores, and we're going to be utilizing fats as more fuel. It's probably not going to help you too much. We've got the Helge data again, looking at the effects of doing a high fat as opposed to high carbohydrate. You're going to get that improvement in general probably more because you're just taking in more than adequate calories. Underfueling is a chronic issue with a number of athletes. And when you're looking at total endurance time, so this is going to be how long someone's going to hold on. Notice this is older work from the 80s, and that individuals giving a high fat diet actually managed to do a little bit better. Well, it turns out part of that is because they're literally taking in more calories. So be careful about that. In general, what we're going to see is if you're talking about really well-trained athletes, a higher fat diet is actually not really doing you a lot of favors when it comes to enhancing your performance, specifically when you compare it to a higher carb diet. Okay. What we're going to find is when you're doing high intensity work for shorter intervals, it's going to typically cause potential issues if you're doing a high fat diet because, well, it turns out like anything else, you're not having as good a glycogen stores as you would have if you went with that higher carb diet. So at the end of the day, if you're really looking to try to be the best athlete you can, and anything outside of something that's just straight up ATP PCR or beta oxidation, you need to go higher with the carbohydrates. Don't worry about doing that high of a fat diet. That's for performance. If someone enjoys a ketogenic diet, let them do it. But if their goal is to be the best, insert 400-meter sprinter, CrossFitter, basketball player, you're going to need carbs. Now, I do want to touch on both cholesterol and ketones, because obviously the ketogenic diet is something that's going to be really important out there, or not important, but so much is becoming popular with a lot of fanfare for a lot of individuals. Cholesterol is important because remember, guys, that's the basic backbone of literally all of our sex hormones, our stress hormone, and our mineral corticoid, aldosterone. Now, it's also important because cholesterol is literally incorporated into that phospholipid bilayer, and it gives our cells a little bit more strength and integrity. When we don't have enough cholesterol, our cells are too fluid, the membranes, and they're more likely to fall apart. That's why at the end of commercials for things that are cholesterol lowering drugs like Lipitor and otherwise, you hear the warning of if you have sudden muscle pain or weakness. That's actually going to be rhabdomyolysis that happens because literally the muscles are they're falling apart because their membranes are so weak, and that's just from hanging out. So you need cholesterol, and the body is going to produce a lot of it on its own, and that's going to be mostly through its own signaling, thanks to effectively your omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acid intake. Now, specifically, the omega-6 is what's going to allow us to be able to essentially create a little bit more, but it's a bit more pro-inflammatory, and hence the omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid balance seems to be something that's becoming a little bit more popular to talk about, but it is something that, obviously is important. So when we talk about ketone bodies are naturally produced as essentially partially digested fatty acids. And then this in turn is going to go into the bloodstream. Now, acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyrate, and acetone are three major different types of ketone bodies. They'll be produced by the liver, and then they're going to go throughout circulation and be utilized similar to carbohydrates for metabolism. That's why do you guys know what specific health condition that the ketogenic diet is actually very useful in a number of cases with helping treat?
Is it epilepsy?
Yes, great job there, Cass. It's going to be epilepsy, specifically drug-resistant epileptic patients, meaning they've used 3 different drugs, which are the strongest in pharmaceutical science, to fix the problem. If they don't work, half the time after that, a ketogenic diet will actually cause the seizures to be controlled and go away. The reasoning for it is it turns out you're depleting your carbohydrates to such a level that you literally, when the brain tries to go into the epileptic storms, it can't. It doesn't have the energetic availability to go that quickly. So ketone bodies can be utilized obviously by your nervous system for energy. However, it happens at a much slower rate. There is some arguments that this might help a little bit with performance. And yes, it can be a little acidic. So you've probably heard about ketoacidosis, which is something that can happen for individuals with diabetes. This is a different outcome than worrying about that situation. Now, one thing that I also want to point out while we're looking at this, probably anyone here can tell me what acetone is something that is commonly used for? Yes, Colleen, it is nail polish remover. So your body's naturally producing that as a metabolic byproduct. And now that acetone it's not going to kill you. It's not going to cause that issues if we're talking about a normal healthy person inducing dietary ketosis. However, it is one of those things where it's actually going to cause kind of a fruity smell in the breath. And there might be some potential issues with wasting if they're not careful. In true ketogenic diets, 80% fat and the remaining 20% is left over between protein and carbohydrate. It is very, very hard to adhere to. A lot of folks have trouble with sticking to a ketogenic diet. So, but like anything else, remember guys, when a diet's successful, people tend to become very evangelical about the method they used in order to lose that weight. Now, what we have over here, guys, and let me size this up so you guys can see it a bit better, okay? Well, that did not look too well, but we can see how literally all of these different types of oils that you come across are going to have varying amounts of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. So coconut oil is chiefly going to be saturated fatty acids. Actually, notice guys, it's even higher than beef, tallow, and lard, which is obviously the fat rendered from pigs. And then we can see other fatty acids, or essentially oils like olive oil is actually mostly going to be made of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So we're going to get differing amounts of each of those fatty acids depending on effectively what the choice. So when you gave the food examples earlier, now does it make sense where I was like, that's not how that works, because every food you take in typically has a variety of different fatty acids in it, just like it'll have a variety of different amino acids in it. The key is we just be mindful of, okay, are we getting in enough of what we're looking for, as well as it's having the types of effects on our health we're looking for. So any questions about fats before we do our last little activity for the evening? And also, just to jump in front of it, whenever somebody asks, does fat makes you fat? The answer is no. It's the total calories you're taking in. That's what makes you fat. Now, if you're in a surplus, extra carbs gets converted to fat, boom. Fat's already in fat, fine. And protein isn't really converted into fat. It's just really inefficient, but those carbs are already doing that for you. So it's a caloric surplus. Whatever gets you in a deficit, that's what's going to get you to lose weight. But we always need to keep in mind what is sustainable. Anybody can starve themselves. That's not going to be a long-term something that they can do and maintain. So our last thing we're going to do is we're going to get you guys into groups again, and we're going to go ahead and you guys want to stick with the same groups? You guys want to switch up the groups?
Same groups.
Sounds good. Okay. So this time I expect you guys to deliver. I was a little underwhelmed, not going to lie, by the fatty acid breakdown earlier. So you are going to have obviously one of these 4 scenarios. Your group in turn needs to go ahead and give essentially the food examples you'd have them take in, or the fatty acid choices, and probably both, and the why. Okay. So for example, if I was going to be given an athlete that has to take in 300 grams of fat per day because they're a ketogenic diet athlete and they're massive, I am not going to be like, all right, bacon and cheese and bacon and cheese and bacon and cheese and bacon and cheese. Like, fuck, no. Pardon my language, guys. It's been a long day. Instead, what I'm going to be looking at is like, okay, well, we're going to throw in some avocado because it's going to be a lot of mono unsaturated fatty acids, as well as, yes, we're definitely going to have some animal sources. We'd probably try to source some fish or otherwise and use potentially some more fatty cuts of meat. And then we're going to be putting in a healthy smattering of different types of nuts. So we're getting in all of our essential fatty acids, we're getting in plenty of omega-3s, and obviously we're finishing the rest with a bunch of monosaturated fatty acids. So maybe even using things like peanuts and otherwise are typically a bit higher. And personally, if they weren't so expensive, I do more often macadamia nuts because I definitely have a penchant for those. So have fun. It is currently 6:54. We'll plan on seeing you guys back at 7, but I want the serving sizes, the food choices you made, and then obviously how you're going to distribute that given what the athlete is doing. So have fun, guys. See you back here, and we'll give you a little after 7. Would not be opposed to really just almost do it straight up by supplements of giving them just fish oil tabs or have them take some type of like liquid fish oil. And then you're right, there's going to be just a little bit in all the other foods that they're taking in. So good work there. Now, Cass, with your guys's. That's a lot of chocolate for lunch. And also, don't be afraid to throw some eggs in breakfast. There's nothing wrong with there. And then, yeah, depending on the fish option as well. Good, Cass. Okay, so and no worries, London. You guys got a good base there. You might not be able to do yogurt, or you have to be very specific with the type just because of the carbs that come with it. But otherwise, I think you guys have got a good breakdown. Usually folks that are going that hard in the ketogenic, that's where you see them adding a lot of oil. So you could do something like a salad with like a cup of olive oil, vinegar and oil or something like that as a dressing, and utilize that. And folks, that's the big key. There's nothing wrong with if you enjoy your chocolate or otherwise, live life and enjoy yourself. The key is like anything else, what's our goal? If our goal is performance, we might have to make some choices. If our goal is to eat like a child and eat whatever we want, that's fine. It's your life, you live it accordingly. It's like anything else. I'm usually speaking from the lens of performance, but you need to also keep in mind some folks, actually this lends itself to a good conversation, which we also need to talk about the joys of caloric balance and everything that goes into calories out, because a lot of people struggle with that on the exam. But first, Sam, okay. Cheese is not vegan. Cheese definitely comes from an animal. Good. So you've got oats and quinoa. What else could we do?
It's quicker to just say this out loud instead of trying to type all this. We also came up with olive oil and coconut oil, which both have 14 grams of fat. And I know you're about to say that coconuts are a nut, but I'm allergic to nuts and I can still have coconuts.
Good. And that is a nice thing to hear. The reason I give that example is actually I have a friend that's allergic to all nuts, including coconut. So
really, that's so interesting.
Yeah, he calls himself the worst vegan ever. It's actually pretty entertaining. There's an interview that he gave for this class, Jake Decker, that's worth listening to if you guys are interested in the YouTube channel, because he's also an ultra marathoner and does a lot of distance. So his approach is fascinating. But yeah, that's where you use your plant-based oils. That's where you'd throw in your olive oil. Not a big fan of corn oil, but you've got some other options that you can put on there. And so avocado oil, you see that being used in certain cases. And yeah, that one's tricky. That one's tricky, but good job there, Abby and group. Just so we're clear. Now, when it comes to caloric balance, guys, remember we've got our protein, carbs, and fat that we're taking in, and then some of you guys alcohol. But then on the out, we've got our resting metabolic rate. We've got our thermic effect of food. We've got our exercise energy expenditure, and we have our wonderful non-exercise activity thermogenesis. When we're gaining weight, our BMR goes up because we're now heavier. Our thermic effect of food is probably going up because we're now eating more. We're burning more calories doing exercise because we have a heavier body. And then we're possibly fidgeting more. And so that's where some folks, they need to get a much larger caloric surplus than you'd really expect in order to gain weight, because they're literally just going to be moving a lot more and moving a heavier body. So it becomes much more daunting for them to stay that size. Now, on the flip side, when people are losing weight, they now have a smaller RMR because they have a smaller body. They are going to have a lower thermic effect food because they're taking in less food. They're going to quite possibly have the same or lower exercise energy expenditure, depending on if they're ready to offset it because they have that lighter body, and they typically are going to fidget less. And so when we're gaining and losing weight, we naturally have those things working against us. So a lot of you guys could just eat a 100 calorie surplus or 100 calorie deficit every single day and not really lose any weight. Instead, you have those little modifications of your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, your thermic effect of food, that effectively has you just sticking so you never really change. And that's one of the things to keep in mind when we do any type of diet with an individual. We need to make sure there's a big enough caloric difference that you're actually going to put them in that deficit or put them in that surplus and get them sustainable weight change at a rate that they're going to be able to maintain. That's why it's sustainable for however long. And then we're going to be able to maintain that change for the long haul. That's one of the biggest issues with diet, which is, are we going to be able to live in such a way that we're going to be able to maintain ourselves for a long period of time? Which brings us back to the joys of chocolate for some of you guys. I don't care. I'm not a chocolate fan, never have been. However, obviously a number of you guys are. Now, in the chat, guys, put up a food that you know you cannot control yourself for the amount of it you're going to take in. So like if somebody puts something in front of you and you are going to crush it, irregardless of like, no, I'll only have one. And then you're like, I ate the entire jar. I ate so much spaghetti that now I am regretty type situation. Okay. So, I like the little situation here, and we're seeing how many of you guys have the same type of foods you enjoy. Now, if you're on a diet and you're actively trying to lose weight, how many of these foods you know you just need to not do, because you're not going to stop with just one Oreo. You're not going to stop with just one Reese's peanut butter cup. You're not just going to stop with 3 chips and like a tablespoon of salsa. Like if you're going to go, you're going to go. I've got a GA that he does the same thing with peanut butter, or had a GA, where effectively like he does like, yeah, I'm just going to do a tablespoon of peanut butter, half a jar of peanut butter later. So when we're looking at putting in foods that we enjoy in the diet, we need to also think about the psychology of the person we're working with. How many folks can do a really good job of that portion control given certain foods? So when we say portion control given certain foods, are we ever really worried about someone overeating broccoli? Are we worried about them overeating plain chicken breast? Are we worried about them overeating plain oatmeal with nothing in it? No person that you would trust watching your child or your young niece or nephew. So obviously there's those certain really hyper palatable food, the foods that have got the high amounts of sugar, fat, and salt combination. That's why, Reese's peanut butter cup, and then think about it, that's got the peanut butter, that's got chocolate, and that's got a little bit of salt from the nuts as well as fat. And then obviously the sugar on the chocolate. It's the reason why a lot of folks are going to have a hard time controlling themselves. So we need to think tactically about which foods can we really not incorporate into the diet, because we know they're going to have a real hard time controlling themselves. And that's the other reason why when we're trying to gain weight, we want to sometimes utilize really palatable foods, aka things that are really enjoyable. So you're going to naturally want to eat a lot more like well-seasoned stir-fried rice. You're not going to want to overeat a lot of plain oatmeal or a lot of plain rice. So we're making choices to actually, when we're trying to lose weight, make our meals perhaps a little bit less enjoyable, because we're not going to have as many issues with overeating it. Meanwhile, when we're trying to gain weight and be having a hard time doing it, that's why in certain conditions, they'll flat out have them put down and do a lot of ice cream and other types of sweets in order to really try to jack up their body weight. So thank you guys for listening. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Next week, we're going to talk about protein and our application of it. Anything else you guys want me to cover? Make sure you're staying on top of your literature review paper. Make sure you're staying on top of your metabolic project. And then obviously all these different dietary scenarios that you guys are having for take-home assignments, make sure you're getting those in. And I know a couple of you guys had issues with the app, with the attaching it. Just check to see if you got a grade enter there. I know one person, they did a fine job. It's just the email didn't, or the assignment didn't come through correctly, but the email did. So we took care of that. And yes, we can definitely do that. So if there's no other questions, comments, concerns, guys, whenever you're ready, you guys have a great night. Stay safe out there, and I will chat with you guys again soon. So bye-bye.